Filling 6 new raised beds, one 30 inches tall, was no easy task. Whenever we're getting ready to fill a new raised bed, we want to create the best soil mix to support the crop while not breaking the bank. The great news is there's really no one-size-fits-all recipe, which means we have options. In fact, each of my beds that you see here was filled a little bit differently. If you're looking to fill new raised beds, I have lots of options for you. You'll be able to see here the base pattern that I follow, but also the different ingredients I use and the order in which I add them. I've been filling my raised beds using these principles for many years with fantastic results. But before I did any filling, I needed to seat the beds on the ground, not the gravel, and then level the beds. First, I had to remove the gravel. In this particular space, we had put landscape fabric under the gravel. I could have left it there, but I really like for my shorter beds to have contact with the ground so that roots can expand if needed, and so that the ground soil can mingle with the raised bed soil. This is optional, but it's what I prefer. So I ripped the landscape fabric just enough to get that ground to soil contact. After that, I replaced the bed and made sure the bed was level to the ground. I adjusted by adding or removing rocks whenever necessary just to get it level. Let's now look at how I filled each of these beds one by one. As you saw in the first video of this kitchen garden series, I already had all of these beds planned out, so I knew what I needed to fill first. This 30-inch tall Birdie's raised bed was my first priority because I knew I'd be planting carrots as one of my first crops. As of this recording, they have already started to sprout. I only needed about 6 to 12 inches of high quality topsoil compost blend at the top. You'll see this as a pattern in all of the beds. Well, almost all of them, but we'll get to that one in a minute. So my task was finding organic matter to fill the bottom 18 to 24 inches. The first thing I added was scraps from my greenhouse that I'd collected over the winter. Next, I added sweet potato and bean vines from last season. I had just piled them up last fall at harvest, and now I'm using the organic matter at the bottom. Next, I added straw from my straw bale garden last year, which has a generous amount of compost in it from the straw bale gardening process. As I started reaching the top, I wanted to begin incorporating soil, but because I knew the organic matter would settle a lot, I didn't want to choose my good soil just yet. I wanted to save that for the top. I added instead used container soil from my grow bags and from my GreenStalk planters. The GreenStalk had had that same soil in it for about 2 to 3 seasons, so I felt like it was time for a refresh. But I wanted to find a way to reuse that soil, so I added it in here. Next, I started adding some of the compost, both that I buy in bulk, and I added a bag that I bought at my local nursery. But when I opened that bag, I realized that it had a high amount of bark content, so I knew I needed to mix it in well with the other compost that I had. I didn't want it to rob nitrogen from my crops right where the roots would be concentrated. After that, I continued adding a compost and topsoil blend until the soil reached the top. Now you'll notice here that the soil is not at the top anymore. I'm going to talk to you about that in just a minute. But first, let's move on to bed number 2. Since these beds are only 15 inches tall, I aim for about half of that to be comprised of rough organic matter at the bottom, followed by a topsoil and compost blend at the top. In this case, I continued with the spent sweet potato vines, but I also added some okra stalks and some other woody garden debris from last year. Next, I added a bag of fallen leaves. These were from a tree with smaller leaves, so I didn't bother shredding those. I followed the leaves with spent straw from, again, my last year's straw bale garden. At this point, I got some help from my nephew, and he began topping off this soil with this topsoil and compost blend. For these beds' organic matter base, I headed out to my garden and pulled out corn stalks from last season. Then I laid them across the bottom of the bed. For the next layer, it was time to clean out the chicken coop from the winter, so I harvested the mixture of chicken manure and pine shavings from the coop. This mixture will be a nice source of long-term nitrogen, but because of the high amount of pine shavings we use for the winter, I didn't want to let this get too close to the top, lest those pine shavings rob the soil of nitrogen temporarily as they're breaking down into compost. Also, because these 2 beds will house tomatoes and potatoes, I knew I didn't want too much nitrogen. That's why I tried to keep the chicken manure mixture toward the bottom of the bed. Seeking out a source of organic matter that is more balanced, then I headed out to my compost piles where I found partially broken down compost from the winter. This is a great amendment for the bottom to the middle of a bed because it will continue to compost and add nutrients to the soil. I followed this with shredded leaves and more straw from my straw bale garden from last year. Finally, we topped off the beds with a topsoil and compost blend. But when we were topping off this bed, I noticed that as we were adding to it, that the pile from which we were drawing ended up having more topsoil than I wanted. Because the topsoil that I get in bulk tends to be more of a heavy soil, I decided to amend this mixture with a ProMix potting mix. This was to create a more well-draining media that also allows more oxygen to the plant's roots. Bed number 5 followed the same pattern. You can start to see here that my goal is to get more rough organic matter toward the bottom, followed by a more broken down organic matter with more nutrients, and then finally topping it off with a beautiful topsoil and compost blend that I buy from my local landscaping company. One thing to note is that I do like to do the filling as far ahead of planting as possible, because by using this method, the soil settles considerably as the weight of that topsoil is applied to the bed, especially when you have a lot of that rough organic matter at the bottom. If possible, I like to go back right before planting and top off the bed, though I know that no matter how many times I top it off, it's going to continually settle. This isn't a bad thing though, because it's always good to amend your soil with fresh compost once or twice a season, and the natural settling that you get using this method allows room to do this. But you may have noticed in these videos here that bed number 6 is not like the rest. Let's take a look at that one. By the time I got to bed number 6, I was frankly tired of filling raised beds. That's when I came up with the idea to incorporate straw bale gardening in this bed. I actually just taught a live workshop on straw bale gardening the same day I made the impulse decision to go get these 2 bales of straw. Now, if you're interested in straw bale gardening, you can purchase a replay to that workshop at this link below, or we'll also link it in the description. Since I plan to grow squash and zucchini in this bed, and those crops love the straw bale garden method, I thought it was the perfect choice. Then next season, all I have to do is add the topsoil and compost blend to the top of this beautiful straw bale garden matter that you saw me use in my other beds. The next step, setting irrigation. When it came time to selecting which irrigation method to use for these raised beds, I only considered one option. In the next video of this kitchen garden series, I'll share all about that. So make sure you're subscribed to follow along.